For me, the holy grail is the perspective opposed to my own. I don't like to, not only do I not like to write about myself, I want to get as far away as I can. And the perfect distance is to be in actual opposition.
You are Jennifer Egan. You are the author of many books, but for this case, A Visit from the Goon Squad, which we picked as our critics' pick for EW's Best of the Decade. But perhaps more importantly, you won the Pulitzer. You won the National Book Critics Circle Award for the book. And this month, this June, is the 10th anniversary. It could have been written like yesterday. It seemed so prescient, which I think obviously is probably every author's best wish. But I guess first I'll ask, have you read, do you reread any of your books? Have you gone back to revisit the book at all recently?
I never just sit down and reread my books, no, because I'm so critical. I'm worried that no good can come of it. Either I'll read it and think, oh my God, I can't believe I'll start wanting to edit it and it's too late. Or in a way, the other possibility is even worse, which is, oh, I can't do this anymore. This is better than what I'm doing now. So I've gotten worse. So basically there's sort of no possible benefit to me. But I have to say, I think about Goon Squad a lot because I'm actually writing a companion volume now that I'm sort of heading into the finishing stretches of. So I do find myself thinking a lot about the characters, some of whom reappear, and also just about a lot about how I arrived at the structure and how it's a real conundrum to sort of take a book like Goon Squad and try to find a way to write a book that relates to it, doesn't feel derivative, doesn't just feel like a weaker version. Obviously, hopefully doesn't feel like an abject failure. You want it to be kind of its own thing and yet related. So I've been thinking a lot about sort of what is Goon Squad and how do I do that with this new material. So it's sort of lovely to talk about it actually because I'm wrestling with questions about its creation.
I'm curious when you started working on Goon Squad and how long you worked on it and then kind of where your writing career was at that point. Because I know you've had a few books that you kind of come back and forth. So I'm wondering what the life of this was.
I mean, it was basically, I had finished The Keep, which is, very different, gothic thriller. Yeah. I had done some research for the book I published a couple of years ago, Manhattan Beach, which is a historical novel set in New York during World War II. So I could feel that was going to be a really massive project, as indeed it was, because it involved a lot of technical expertise in areas I knew nothing about. And I think I was a little stymied in sort of how to begin that. And my kids were also really young. I mean, when The Keep was published in 2006, they were 5 and 3. So in an almost accidental way, as I struggled to figure out how to even approach the research I needed to do for this book, a sort of surprising thing occurred, which is that I was meeting my mom for dinner. She was staying in a hotel in New York. And I was using the ladies' room, and I looked down and I saw a wallet sitting in a woman's bag. And I felt anxious immediately, I think mostly because I've been robbed just an astounding number of times and ways. I'm clearly not only gullible, but oblivious, because it's incredible how many ways it's happened. But the most shocking case was many years ago. My whole purse was stolen, and I was, freaking out because I was supposed to fly later in the day, and I didn't have any money to get to the airport. I was just like, what do I do? And in the middle of it all, I got a call from the Citibank Fraud Recovery Program, and this very nice woman said, we understand your wallet has been stolen, and I said yes, and so we went through the whole process of how to replace all of my items, and I needed a new cash card, obviously, which she said I could pick up at the bank. I picked a new PIN number. She said, no, it can't be the same as the old one. And so I said, no, and I explained the difference. We got off the phone, and the long and short of it is she was the thief. So
my God.
she had now completed a very successful con operation because now she had the cash card and she had the PIN number. So she rushed to the nearest cash machine and actually overdrew my account, which I didn't even know you could do. So this all came to light sort of in stages over the next couple of hours. When I went to the bank to pick up my card, the bank was closed. Like none of it really added up at all. So I was flipping out and very upset, but it all worked out. Somehow I got to the airport, I got the money back. The banks are insured for that. But what I was left with was just this tremendous curiosity about the woman herself. Like, who was she? I spent 10 minutes on the phone with this woman. She was very good at impersonating a bank employee. Like,
I was going to say, she's good at her job of being a thief.
Very good. To the point where I wondered, is she a bank employee? Like, has she actually done that work? Anyway, I was very curious about her. And I found myself thinking, I want to use this somehow in fiction, but I couldn't really find a way. And then many years passed and it just became a funny story. And then I actually kind of forgot about it. But in this moment of looking at this wallet, I thought, I could take this wallet. So in that moment, I sort of reconnected with the perspective of the person who steals. And that is my favorite thing, because for me, the holy grail is the perspective opposed to my own. Not only do I not like to write about myself, I want to get as far away as I can. And the perfect distance is to be in actual opposition. So I was excited by this wallet sighting. And I thought, tomorrow I'm just going to start writing from that moment. Let's just see what happens. And so I did, and I wrote what became the first chapter.
Yeah.
And then there was kind of a brief reference to a guy who sprays pesticide in his armpits and puts gold flakes in his coffee. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. Why does he do that? And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write another story from his point of view. So I did that. And then I thought, there was a mention of his ex-wife, and I thought, who is she? So I thought, I'll write one more. But then what I noticed was that I was just really enjoying this material.
Right.
So I thought, I'm just going to stay with this. And in a way, by then, a lot of things about the book had already been decided, even before I realized it was a book. And so I just tried to basically just keep doing what seemed the most fun.
So did you consider at all writing a novel that was just like, let's say Sasha, Benny, maybe like one or two other characters that just kind of went Sasha, Benny, someone else, Sasha, Benny, someone else, and kind of kept within their perspective? Or did you immediately say, no, I want this to be like a very unique format with all these kind of linked stories?
It didn't seem that unique. I think maybe because I was already kind of doing it, but it was very clear to me that I did not want to actually use the same point of view more than once. So I absolutely committed to having I liked the idea of each piece seeming like it was part of a different book from all of the others, and yet having them actually fuse into something that had an arc of its own. I just thought, why not do two opposite things at the same time if I can? So that was always the idea. And there were a lot of failures. I mean, it's not like I just, swaggered my way through and like everything I did worked. No way. There were things I just pounded my head against. There were perspectives I was dying to explore, but I could never make it work. And one of the things, one of the other rules that I didn't really make it, but that I discovered in seeing that these early chapters had this relationship among each other was that I knew that I wanted each one to be different technically from all of the others. I really didn't want any two to feel like they were part of the same book. I wanted them to be kind of texturally different, if you will. And that was the hardest one to stick to, because at a certain point, first person, third person, multiple points of view, kind of invasive omniscience, second person, a celebrity profile. Like I had sort of done everything I could do, and then there were things I couldn't do, like epic poetry, which was a real bust. I tried writing one in the sort of using the conventions of drama, like not using he said, she said, but just having dialogue appear with the name of the person talking didn't work. So there were a lot of things I tried that I couldn't do, and sometimes that would end up closing me off from a character I wanted to explore as well.
Were there any characters that you had to like really struggle to either like create or decide that you wanted them to be part of the story? Like, it sounds like a couple of the first ones really came naturally and like kind of bandied from one to the next, and it sounds like it was at least a little bit more natural. But were any of the characters who wound up getting their own sections like hard for you?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the one of the weird things about my process is that I don't usually start with characters. I start with a time and a place. So that was what led me through it more than the characters. And so I started with the wallet, and that was like very much a kind of New York in the around 2006, sort of not long after 9/11, hotel kind of atmosphere, young single woman. And then the next one, which was about Benny, again, sort of I had to do a lot of research for that, about the music industry. And then Benny mentions having been a punk rocker. And so my next area of curiosity was this punk rock moment that I witnessed in my teenage years in San Francisco. I didn't know right away who would narrate that. All I knew was that it wouldn't be Benny. And what drew me into it was really the excitement of capturing some of this kind of fascinating history that I witnessed, and this particular club, the Mabuhay Gardens, which is a very storied place to this day. There are Facebook pages and people sharing memories. So, and then out of that curiosity came my narrator, Rhea, who sees Benny and, from her own point of view, and this kind of group of people. So often it would be the place. And then actually, to give you another example, so in that chapter, Ask Me If I Care, about the punk rock time set in 1979, there's a moment where two of the girls look at a picture of one of their much older boyfriends, Lou, inappropriately older, and he's on a trip to Africa with his family, and he has a lot of children. And I thought, so that's interesting. Lou is this old lechy guy. We can see that. And yet he's also a family man in some way, and that's a different, he's got to be different in those circumstances. And here he is on this safari. And so that I was sort of led into that kind of out of time, different part of the world with an excitement about just exploring those textures. And I had been on a safari long, long ago. It was actually the first time I really left America on a family trip when I was 18. So I was often led by the place, and then out of the place would come the people. But to answer your question, I definitely had a huge struggle because there was one, I really wanted to see Sasha in college. I was interested in the kind of early 90s grunge moment of music. I wanted New York at that moment. I really wanted that sort of proto-internet moment when a few people knew about the internet, but most people didn't know at all, because in 1992. So I wanted to see Sasha, as a young woman, and so I just couldn't figure out how to sort of get to her, what eyes I could look at her through. And, each time I would bring in an entirely new character, that would entail a kind of responsibility. Like suddenly they have a whole life attached to them. And like, where does it stop? And if I'm just bringing someone in to do a job of looking at someone else, that never works. The person has to be it has to be their own universe, or it won't be interesting. So I struggled to create Rob. Rob, who dies at the end of that chapter.
Tore my heart out.
He was I really struggled with him. But finally, it almost felt like a miracle, the different somehow I was able to kind of work my way through that, but it was really hard. That was the biggest struggle.
And it's interesting to hear that as the reader, because again, that section was so poignant to me. And it's funny, I had remembered, or I had forgotten that when I first read the book, that I wasn't sure as a reader, and maybe this was how everyone read it, what happened to him in the river until I got to, I guess it was that the PowerPoint section where it is kind of fully revealed. And like, then going back and reading it again this weekend, I was like, oh God, it's so heart-wrenching. It's so interesting that was like a struggle. And one thing I'm curious too is you mentioned like the 70s San Francisco and kind of all this stuff. And you said that you wanted to write, like what's interesting to you is writing as far away from yourself as you can, like the perspective. But a lot of this includes things that you, like periods of time or areas or cities that you lived through. So like naturally some of that kind of comes in. Did you have to, like, was that did it naturally seep in, or did you have to kind of take care to remove it?
No, I mean, the times and places I remember are the big point of contact between my life and the fiction that I write. But no one is ever me. I think that's really the key. I need to not be in the point of view of someone who feels like they see things the way I do. That's where I really have trouble. I freeze. I'm bad at it. I don't write good personal essays. I find it boring. And so there's sort of like the excitement is not there for me. And if I start to get a whiff of my own experience, my own point of view creeping in, I know it immediately because I stop being interested. So writing from the point of view of the thief is the perfect example of that. The situation I knew very, very well, but from the opposite point of view. I can't imagine myself writing about, although actually in Goodbye My Love, where, Sasha is stealing another wallet, her uncle's, that is from his point of view. But the theft of the wallet is really kind of a small part of the whole thing.
Sure.
And he's a man. And that's another thing. I love writing from a male point of view because it immediately separates the person I'm looking through the eyes of from myself. And I really struggled in Goon Squad to not tip too far toward the male. And I'm struggling with this new one. I mean, given my druthers, I will just go male. It's kind of fascinating. And, and The Keep, the book before Goon Squad, is really almost entirely male. So I was determined not to do that again in Goon Squad. And I was really counting all the time, like, okay, I'm six male, 4 female. I gotta move this toward the female. I have to really force myself.
How did you keep track of, like, there's so many like small threads throughout the Goon Squad that come back and connect through each chapter and each chapter. Did you have to keep, like, I'm picturing like, I don't know if you watch Homeland, but like a Carrie Mathison wall with strings, or did it really all just like live in your head, and anything where it connected was like a added bonus, or how did you do that? It
was not that hard. I mean, the connections were connections I had followed myself to get into whatever new thing it was. So, for example, with Safari, that grew out of the story before. So yes, there's this little picture of them in Africa, and boom, then we're there. So often I was just following the same trail of crumbs that the reader is following. Once I knew what the order was, which was a big question, because when I was writing it, I actually thought I was going to go in a backwards chronology. So that was actually something I had wrong. And I only discovered that I worked on the pieces very individually because I didn't want them to start to sound at all the same. I really wanted to hold on to that feeling that they were each part of a different work. But when I finally did read them together in the backwards order, I discovered that the book did not have much power, which was very, very disappointing. And I realized that one of the reasons was that that chronology sort of undermined a lot of those fun little connections. I mean, just as an example, we learned that Benny was a punk rocker in the story called The Gold Cure, which takes place in like 2007 or something. 2006, because it's 5 years after 9/11. But in my backwards chronology, we didn't get to see Benny as a punk rocker till like 8 chapters later. We have to get all the way back to 1979, at which point no one remembers that about him or is especially excited to find themselves seeing him in high school. So I realized those little connections matter way more than chronology, that they were a much better organizing principle. Once I had decided on the better order, then I could find other ways to weave the material together and other obvious connections that maybe I wasn't quite making, but they were sort of ready to be made. So there was a kind of fine combing together of some of this material. But for the most part, the connections happened organically and actually helped to suggest other parts of the book to me.
And the final chapter that's like written obviously futuristically, is that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's essentially around 2019, 2020, right?
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? I know. It seemed like it was the future.
Yes.
And now it's like, God, that really wasn't that long.
It flew by, but two, I'm sure you've talked about this because some of the things that you kind of predicted came to light previous to this year. But something that I found so interesting was just the kind of eerie, New York feels a little bit eerie, right? In that portion, whether it's the notions of what the environment has, the environmental changes on the sunset and the wall against the water and things. There's this kind of this eerie, weird feeling, and it kind of seems like that's the exact feeling that New York had. I mean, I was in New York the end of March was the last time I was there, but the same kind of thing, both from technology, time, and just coronavirus quarantine. It was so interesting for me to read that portion of New York now.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, it's not an exciting vision of the future at all. I mean, a lot of it has, of course, been superseded by reality. So it reads more like verisimilitude. I mean, for one thing, Hurricane Sandy hadn't happened yet when I was writing that. So, I mean, it's actually possible that we may end up with a wall. I mean, if we can't figure out how to deal with the climate crisis, I mean, it's on the table. So that's not something I would invent anymore because it's not a fun thing. It's just a response to reality. The other really kind of, another way in which I've really been superseded is with the sort of handset technology. I mean, when I was writing that, the iPhone hadn't come out. So the iPhone came out in 2008, and I didn't get one till 2011. So the idea of toddlers holding touchscreens seemed hilarious, hilarious and far-fetched. And now, of course, it's banal. So in a lot of ways, there's not too much that's really very exciting about my vision of the future. But it is funny thinking about the COVID moment because the one connection that I've made recently to Goon Squad is the constant choppers, the constant helicopters. They're flying overhead ever since the demonstrations began. They're hovering overhead all the time, and that's the only time I've ever experienced that. And it's sort of the last thing that I wrote about that I hadn't actually experienced yet, and now that's happened too. So, it's hard to, I was not very far ahead, and in fact, the period I was writing was not very far ahead, so it's all moved forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We have, in LA, I think we've had the same kind of thing with the helicopters, but they've been much more prevalent prior to all the demonstrations. Helicopters were just more common in LA because of the landscape is larger, so they just kind of rely on helicopters all the time. But again, yeah, it's been omnipresent, and I had kind of forgotten until I read the book that before I lived in LA, helicopters were not a part of my daily life the way that
they're so loud. Oh my God.
I'm curious if there's a character in Goon Squad who, because I'm sure a lot of your readers can all give their own answer of like who kind of strikes them the most, whether it's their favorite character who just kind of like stays with them more than anyone else. I'm curious if now, even like 10 years later, if there's a certain character, and maybe as you're writing this new book that's kind of a continuation, I don't want you to spoil anything of that book, but if you've had any observations about kind of your connection there.
I was really partial to Benny. I think he's the one I sort of identified the most with. And actually, it's interesting to hear. I mean, I have found often that women tend to feel that the book is about Sasha, and men tend to feel that the book is about Benny, which is great. I feel like it should be whatever. It's it's out of my hands. It's whatever people end up reading. But one thing that's kind of funny about that book is that when I sold it, the PowerPoint wasn't in there. I had been trying to use PowerPoint and I just could not make it work for me. I had a number of failures, and it's not easy to write fiction in PowerPoint. It doesn't really lend itself to fiction for a number of reasons. So I had kind of hacked away at it, but it hadn't worked. And so I turned it in without the PowerPoint, and it's not like anyone would have read it and said, gee, if only there were a PowerPoint. I mean, that was not going to occur to anyone. But without the PowerPoint, the book really does. It tips the book toward Benny in a big way.
Right.
Because we see Benny in his future, in sort of around now, 2020-ish, but we don't see Sasha. The latest point in time at which we view Sasha without that chapter is chapter 1. And I knew that was really a flaw. It felt like a structural weakness in the book that I could not find a way around. I just couldn't figure out how to write about her. We know she ends up in the desert, but I just couldn't wrap my mind around how to approach her. And then I had this kind of brainwave, and it really started again with place. I suddenly started imagining writing about the desert using PowerPoint, and I felt a kind of connection there that was exciting to me. And then another big problem I had with PowerPoint, which is really stating the obvious, is that it feels sort of corporate and it feels a little cold. And I somehow, the idea of a child's voice using the PowerPoint in the setting of the desert, that felt kind of alive to me. And then all of a sudden, these shadowy children that we know Sasha has had, because there's that leap forward earlier in the book, all of a sudden, there I was dealing with these kids. And it was so thrilling. And I'm so grateful that it worked out, because I really think, even though, not everyone loves reading that PowerPoint chapter. I've had people say, I use PowerPoint at work. I check it at the door when I sit down to read a novel. Sorry. But I really do think the book is actually a lot stronger with it. So that was a case of, a kind of late addition that I was really lucky to get in there, and that actually makes Benny and Sasha much more kind of equal pillars of the structure.
That's a good point. I loved the PowerPoint, but again, I don't use it at work. So, I have no kind of emotional connections to PowerPoint like that. But what are your kind of memories about the publishing, like the process of the book once you turned it in? And I feel like it had such an interesting life, because like a lot of books, it's had such a long life. And some really blow up the first week and then kind of peter out, and some build and build and build. And this one, I would imagine, had kind of waves of kind of popularity. But how did that, what's your side of that? And how did that feel for you kind of as an author?
First of all, I was so grateful. The publisher could have taken one look at this. So I was doing light revisions, and I sent the book back with this PowerPoint and instructions of how to view it as a slideshow, which they were like, what is she talking about? Of course, they all printed it out because we're print people. What can I say? And so, I will forever be grateful that they were game. They worked with me on it. It needed editing. There was actually some, kind of a focus issue at one point. They helped me so much with that, and then published the book so beautifully. Because one thing was, in 2010, when it came out, e-readers didn't have good graphics yet. And people, this is such an irony, people found the PowerPoint very hard to read on e-readers. And people wrote angry letters to the publisher complaining that they had to buy the physical book to actually read the PowerPoint, which is, you can't blame them for being a little pissed about that. So anyway, it came out, and it came out with it did not do well at all in hardcover. It basically started bombing immediately. And when that kind of situation, everyone feels very anxious. I had not been paid a fortune for it or anything like that, but it was just, the Keep had done really well. And so there was just this feeling of like, oh, this is really too bad. One big problem was that I had not let them call it a novel. It just had no designation. It just said, a visit from the Goon Squad with a picture of a guitar, part of a guitar, and my name. Some people thought it was nonfiction. I mean, they just didn't know what it was. I was afraid that if it were held to the standards of what people considered it to be a novel, they would be disappointed. So I would not let them put a novel on the cover. In retrospect, that was kind of a mistake because I think, those categories serve a purpose, which is marketing. So people didn't know what to make of it, didn't know what it was, and they did not buy it. I mean, that was really how it started. I went on a book tour. I always do. I will do almost anything to sell a book. So I was out there hustling, but it just sort of wasn't happening. And that was June. It came out in June, so it's been exactly 10 years. There were questions were being asked about whether my title was bad. Like, when things start to go wrong, everyone starts to cogitate about what is causing the trouble. And a number of people on my team said, yeah, we didn't really like this title, wish we'd mentioned it to you. And I kind of said, yeah, I wish you had too, because there were 13 internal titles, any of which we could have used. So normally when you publish a book, after 2 or 3 months, you're going to start slipping to the back of the shelves. You don't have a huge window of opportunity. You're certainly not going to still be getting publicity 3 months later. But what I found was that actually that was the first surprise. I did keep getting opportunities for interviews and things like that. I think one thing was that the music industry was totally unaware of the book when it came out, but it gradually started to discover it by fall, let's say. So I started going on, some radio shows and stuff that were specifically geared toward music. I remember specifically I was on New Sounds with John Schaefer, some kind of music head type shows. And I think that was really helpful, actually. I think it started to find some readers. And so I kept doing events because I figured I'd worked so hard on this. I'm pretty slow. There was really no reason to stop. So I kept doing events and, I was getting audiences. I mean, usually you can start to feel when it's time to stop because the room is getting emptier. So then I guess then the end of the year lists started to come out in December, and it made a lot of those, including the 10 for the New York Times. And really it made almost every list. It was actually incredible. Maybe part of it was that they were thinking, well, this book kind of got ignored. Let's give it another shot. But it was still, it was never selling well, but it kind of continued to sell. And then the paperback was due to come out in March, I think. They decided to kind of rush it into paperback because the hardcover seemed to be sort of bombing. And I think they were feeling like we did have really good reviews. We can put a novel on the cover, which really might help. They decided to do a different cover. And I think they just sort of felt like, let's just kind of start over and see if we can convert some of those kind of momentum, but it basically isn't working, into something that is working. So they did that. And then the same month that the book came out, I won the Pulitzer. And that was when things really kind of crossed over into going really well. So it was kind of a strangely long process. I mean, it was 9 months after the original publication that the book really finally started to sell. It was crazy. I've never had anything like that.
I'm curious whether you feel like either the Pulitzer or just this book in general and like kind of the long and like ultimately very successful life it had, did it change things for you as an author or like the trajectory of your career? Do you feel like you look back and notice that, or did it feel like that at the time, or?
Oh my God. It felt like it changed it overnight, and it did. I mean, we live in a world that cares so much about labels and brands and status. So winning a prize, which is basically a matter of luck, in that, you know, you have to please the right group of people at the right time, and that is essentially luck. And I say that as someone who's helped to judge big prizes. And yet if you get that luck, the result is this sort of bizarrely iconic brand association that happens, you know, overnight. I mean, it's really, it's pretty much unfair, and one only likes it when it happens to you, because it's just not. It's you know, it sort of doesn't make any sense at all. But it was pretty nice to have it work in my favor. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I had been slogging away for a long time, and I did not feel like my career was bad at all. I felt like I was improving with each book. In fact, Goon Squad was really the first one where it felt like, wow, I am like taking a big step back. That's how it felt at the beginning. You know, so I wasn't complaining, but it definitely felt like, first of all, my readership increased enormously because Goon Squad then was on the paperback bestseller list for almost a year. So I just had access to so many more readers than I had ever had, and more opportunities. And probably, in a way, maybe one of the things that meant the most to me was really finding an international readership. I had published in various countries, a scattering of countries here and there with different books. But I had never really managed to lock in with an audience, except maybe Germany. That was probably the one exception. I had more of a consistent publishing career there, but it was so thrilling to start traveling, you know, to finally in the UK, where I had published all of my books and yet I was a total unknown. To feel like, and you know, travel's been so important, and I've written a lot about travel, and that has been such a joy to actually have more of an international audience, and I owe that completely to Goon Squad. So it was the golden goose. It really was.
Do you find, is there anything that you like either learned from that time or that like perfected during that time that you find yourself using now, whether it's either like something about your writing or even just navigating the publishing world? Like, is there, I'm just curious kind of what you took from that.
Well,
beyond the luck component, of course.
I think, let's see. I think one thing I learned is try to always stay positive in the conversations that I have in interviews and things like that. You know, it's tempting when people are finally listening to start, I don't know, to get on your hobby horse or be critical of things. That possibility is always there. And I think what I really learned is, you know, as with publishing a book, when you utter something, it is out of your hands once you say it, and you can't contextualize it. So I think one thing I learned early was just really the best way to keep control of the conversation you're having is to make sure that you don't get into any kind of territory that needs a lot of explanation in order to make sense, especially anything that could be interpreted as critical or negative. So that was something I learned. And I think I also learned, I don't know if I learned this then. One of the great things about having any clout, in my opinion, is actually being able to help other people. Because, you know, I have that power right now, and it's not even a question of will it last. It will not last. It never lasts. So I really feel like use it when you have it and use it to do good. I believe that so strongly. I don't think I was in danger of making the mistake of thinking that I would always sort of, you know, that I would always maintain this level of success, because I had been around long enough and watched enough careers and also been publishing enough myself to know that it doesn't work that way. There has to be movement and there has to be change. And that means no one gets to stay in any particular position indefinitely. But that's all the more reason to try to use it to get as much good stuff done as possible for other people who may not have that and may need that help and that boost. So I really have tried. I'm the president of PEN America. This is my 3rd year. It's a lot of work. I mean, I pour a lot of time into that organization. It's a pleasure. I mean, I feel like if I can add value there, I think they're doing important work. It's a gift to me to be able to participate in that. And so I think that's something that, I don't know if I learned it, but it seems very clear to me since publishing Goon Squad.
What do you find is like the most effective way to help others and to kind of do that, as you were saying? Like there are so many, like I know a lot of people, it's either like mentoring or, blurbing for authors that need it, but like what for you do you find is the kind of most effective?
Everything I can for someone I believe in. Either someone who I think hasn't had the recognition that they deserve or hasn't even gotten started at all. And so it has run the gamut. I mean, I still blurb, certainly not everyone or everything, but I have never made that decision to just stop doing that, even though I understand why that's tempting, because it can be overwhelming to be asked a lot for that. But I don't want to put myself in a position where I can't help people that way. And if I say I don't do it anymore, that's what I've done. So connecting people with agents, connecting people with editors, interviewing people about their books at events. There's no one thing. I try, when there's a writer I believe in, I try to see what I can do to help solve whatever problem they're having. Here's another thing. Like I'm often asked to appear in classes that are reading my work. I pretty much always do it because I feel like, why not? Like high school as well. Like, the English major is imperiled. The liberal arts are imperiled. And I think that's actually a disaster. It's another issue I really want to work on when I have more time, because I so vehemently disagree with the idea that a liberal arts education is not marketable when so few people can write even grammatically, much less well, and it's never mattered more. Like, to think analytically and write well, I can't imagine that. I think that matters way more than taking an accounting class in college or a marketing class. That stuff you can pick up any old place, but learning to think and write analytically and grammatically and well, that is hard to do. And you can't learn it later. You have to learn that when you're young. So I believe strongly in a liberal arts education, but reading books, all of that is imperiled. We are all holding these little machines, and they are hypnosis machines. And I say that as someone who doesn't even really watch television, but it's hard to look away. So if there's a room full of people who are reading Goon Squad, and I can get in front of them and make that a richer experience, you bet I'll do it. So I guess I just generally try to use, whatever reputation I have to try to improve things that I can help with wherever possible. And of course, it's a little ad hoc, because where do you start? I mean, I'm the type of person who picks up garbage in the street. I can't do it with my kids there. They won't even, they'll walk away like they don't know me. And there is the danger of becoming a maniac. I recognize that. But I feel this imperative to try to do what I can, whether it's picking up a piece of trash or using the fact that I can ask an agent to read something that I think is good, and they'll hopefully do it. it doesn't mean they'll take the person on as a client, but at least they might give it a read. So why would I not make that connection?
Thank you so much for taking this time to talk with me. I mean, I'm sure you've read all of our glowing reviews, but myself and the EW team just love your work and Goon Squad so much. And so we're so glad to be able to do this.
It was such a wonderful shot in the arm to have that acknowledgement from you guys. This is going to sound crazy, but I hadn't really tracked that it had been 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And I think the reason is just because of the timeline I explained. You know, it was 9 years ago that it became successful, sort of the spring
right.
of 2011, but it came out in June of 2010, and so it was just like a wonderful gift that you guys gave me, and such a nice shot of excitement right at a time when I'm revisiting those characters and actually following them now up to 2034. So we'll see how maybe we'll talk again in 14 years and see how things look. But it was just the timing was magnificent. So thank you so much. It felt like a good luck, a little burst of good luck.